On October 1st, 331 BC, the ancient world held its breath as two titans prepared to clash on a dusty plain in what is now northern Iraq. The fate of empires hung in the balance. On one side stood Alexander of Macedon, the young warrior king who had already conquered half the known world. On the other, Darius III, ruler of the mighty Persian Empire that stretched from India to Egypt. What unfolded that day would shake the very foundations of civilization and change the course of history forever. The morning mist clung to the plains of Gaugamela as the largest armies the ancient world had ever seen faced each other across a carefully prepared battlefield. This was no ordinary confrontation. This was the moment when East would meet West in a collision so violent, so decisive, that its echoes would reverberate through the centuries. The stakes could not have been higher. Victory would mean dominion over the known world. Defeat would mean annihilation. But how did these two mighty forces come to meet on this remote plain? The answer lies in a story of ambition, revenge, and the relentless march of one man's impossible dream. Alexander had already humiliated Darius once before at the Battle of Issus 2 years earlier, sending the Persian king fleeing in panic. Now Darius had summoned every warrior from across his vast empire for one final desperate gamble. This time he would not run. This time he would crush Macedonian upstart, once and for all. The journey to Gaugamela began months earlier, as Alexander led his battle-hardened army through the scorching heat of the Syrian desert. His choice proved brilliant of route wool beyond measure. Instead of taking the direct southern path to Babylon that everyone expected, Alexander chose the northern route through Mesopotamia. This unexpected maneuver caught the Persians completely off guard. They had prepared their defenses for an attack from the south, but Alexander was already slicing through their heartland from an entirely different direction. The psychological warfare began even before the armies met. As Alexander's forces crossed the Tigris River in late September, the heavens themselves seemed to take notice. A near-total lunar eclipse darkened the sky on September 20th, casting an eerie red glow across the landscape. The superstitious soldiers of both armies watched in awe and terror as the moon appeared to bleed. The Macedonians saw it as a sign of divine favor, while the Persians whispered of impending doom. Alexander understood the power of such omens. He called his men together and spoke of the eclipse as Zeus himself blessing their cause. His words rang across the camp with the confidence of a man who believed destiny was on his side. But Darius too knew how to read the signs. In his golden pavilion, surrounded by the treasures of a dozen conquered nations, the Persian king made his own preparations for what he knew would be the battle of his lifetime. The Persian war machine was unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. Darius had spent 2 years gathering forces from every corner of his empire. Warriors came from the snow-capped mountains of Bactria, the burning deserts of Arabia, and the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia. Indian war elephants trumpeted in their enclosures, while Scythian horsemen practiced their deadly archery. Greek mercenaries, veterans of countless battles, sharpened their weapons alongside Persian immortals whose discipline was legendary. The numbers were staggering. Modern historians estimate that Darius commanded somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 troops. Some ancient sources claim the figure was closer to 1 million, though this seems impossibly high. What is certain is that Alexander's army was outnumbered by at least 3 to 1, possibly 5 to 1. Any reasonable commander would have sought terms, negotiated a settlement, or retreated to fight another day. But Alexander was not reasonable. He was something far more dangerous. The Macedonian king commanded roughly 47,000 troops, but these were no ordinary soldiers. They were veterans of a dozen campaigns, hardened by years of constant warfare. The core of Alexander's army was the famous Macedonian phalanx, 9,000 heavy infantry armed with 18-foot spears called sarissas. These men could stop a cavalry charge dead in its tracks and advance like an unstoppable wall of bronze and steel. Beside them marched the hypaspists, the elite shield-bearers who served as Alexander's personal guard. These 3,000 warriors, the finest, were infantry in the world, capable of fighting in close formation or breaking apart to pursue fleeing enemies. On the flanks rode the companion cavalry, the heavy shock troops who had carved through enemy armies from the Danube to the Nile. Led by Alexander himself, These horsemen were the hammer that would shatter Persian resistance. But Darius had learned from his previous defeat. This time, he had chosen the battlefield with care. The plain of Gaugamela was perfect for his purposes. Wide and flat, it would allow his massive full army to deploy in strength. His cavalry would have room to maneuver, and his secret weapons would have clear fields of fire. For weeks, Persian engineers had been preparing the ground, removing rocks and bushes, filling in holes, and creating the perfect killing field. The Persian secret weapon was terrifying to behold. 200 scythed chariots waited in the pre-dawn darkness, their wheels fitted with razor-sharp blades designed to slice through infantry formations like wheat before a scythe. These vehicles of destruction had been tested against mock phalanxes, and the results had been devastating. Darius was confident that they would break Alexander's line in the first minutes of battle. Behind the chariots, 15 Indian war elephants swayed in their chains. These massive beasts, each carrying a crew of archers and spearmen, were living siege engines that could trample infantry and terrify horses. They represented the exotic power of the far reaches of the Persian Empire, brought thousands of miles to crush the Macedonian invaders. As dawn approached on October 1st, both armies began their final preparations. Alexander moved among his troops, calling out individual soldiers by name, reminding them of their victories at Granicus and Issus. His presence was electric. Here was a king who fought in the front ranks, who shared the dangers of the common soldier, who had never known defeat. When he spoke of glory and conquest, men believed him because they had seen him deliver on every promise. The omens continued to favor the Macedonians. As Alexander addressed his troops, an eagle soared overhead, flying directly toward the Persian lines. To the superstitious warriors, this was clearly Zeus, the king of the gods. Their sign from battle cry echoed across the plain as they prepared for what they knew would be the fight of their lives. Across the battlefield, Darius made his own preparations. Clad in golden armor that caught the first rays of sunlight, the Persian king took his position in the center of his vast army. His chariot was a work of art, decorated with precious metals and pulled by the finest horses in the empire. Around him, the Persian immortals formed their ranks, their shields and spears glinting in the morning light. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of two civilizations. On one side, the disciplined might of Macedonia, small in number but unmatched in skill and determination. On the other, the vast diversity of the Persian Empire, drawing strength from a dozen cultures and nations. The ground between them would soon run red with blood, as the greatest military minds of the ancient world put their strategies to the ultimate test. The tension was suffocating as the two armies faced each other across the plain. Alexander had spent the night before the battle in restless preparation, studying maps and consulting with his generals until the early hours. His tactical genius was about to be put to its greatest test. He knew that traditional battlefield tactics would not work against such overwhelming numbers. The hammer and anvil strategy that had served him so well at previous battles would be useless here. He could not hope to encircle an army that stretched beyond the horizon. Instead, Alexander devised something revolutionary. He arranged his forces in multiple lines, creating a formation that had never been attempted in ancient warfare. The main battle line would hold the center, while reserve forces positioned at angles could wheel around to meet flanking attacks or extend the line if needed. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only way to avoid being completely overwhelmed by Persian numbers. The Macedonian formation was a masterpiece of military engineering. In the center stood the phalanx, their massive spears creating an impenetrable hedge of bronze points. To their right, Alexander positioned himself with the companion cavalry, ready to strike like lightning when the moment was right. On the left flank, the veteran General Parmenion commanded the Thessalian cavalry and allied Greek forces. Behind them, a second line of troops stood ready to face about and fight in any direction if the Persians managed to break through or circle around. Darius had his own plan. His strategy was simple but potentially devastating. The scythed chariots would charge first, breaking apart the Macedonian phalanx and creating gaps for his cavalry to exploit. Then his massive wings of horsemen would sweep around both flanks simultaneously, encircling Alexander's smaller army like a closing fist. The sheer weight of numbers would do the rest. It was a sound plan, one that should have worked against any normal opponent. But Alexander was far from normal. As the Persian chariots began their thunderous charge across the plain, the young king had already anticipated this move. His light infantry, armed with javelins and bows, advanced to meet the deadly vehicles. The Agrianian javelineers and Cretan archers had trained for this exact moment. As the chariots bore down on them, they unleashed a storm of projectiles that brought down horses and drivers alike. Those chariots that survived the missile barrage found themselves facing an even more ingenious defense. Alexander had drilled his phalanx in a tactic that seemed impossible. As the scythed chariots crashed into their line, the Macedonian infantry did something that defied every instinct of warfare. They opened lanes in their formation, allowing the chariots to pass through harmlessly while their deadly blades whistled through empty air. The sight was both terrifying and magnificent. Massive war chariots thundered between the ranks of Macedonian soldiers, their scythe blades spinning uselessly as disciplined infantrymen closed ranks behind them. Those few chariots that made it through the phalanx found themselves isolated and surrounded by reserves who quickly dispatched them. Darius watched in growing horror as his secret weapon was neutralized with almost contemptuous ease. The failure of the chariot attack was only the beginning of Persian troubles. Alexander had studied his enemy carefully, and he understood that Darius commanded not a unified army but a collection of different peoples with different languages, different fighting styles, and different levels of commitment to the Persian cause. Communication across such a diverse force was difficult even in the best circumstances. In the chaos of battle, it would be nearly impossible. As the morning wore on, the real battle began to unfold. The Persian wings advanced, trying to envelope Alexander's flanks just as Darius had planned. But Alexander had prepared for this as well. His angled reserve formations wheeled out to meet the threat, extending his battle line and preventing the encirclement. The fighting was fierce and desperate, with cavalry charges crashing against infantry squares while archers filled the air with deadly volleys. The key to Alexander's plan lay not in holding his ground, but in creating the perfect opportunity to strike. While his flanks held firm against overwhelming odds, Alexander began one of the most audacious maneuvers in military history. Leading his companion cavalry, he started moving toward the right edge of the battlefield, drawing more and more Persian cavalry after him like a magnet attracting iron. This was the moment that would define the battle and change the course of history. Darius, watching from his golden chariot, saw Alexander's movement and ordered more troops to pursue the Macedonian king. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to crush Alexander once and for all by concentrating overwhelming force against him. But this was exactly what. As more Alexander want Persian cavalry strink, aimed toward the right fill to open gap, began in their center. It was not a large gap, barely visible among the mass of humanity that covered the battlefield, but Alexander's eagle eyes spotted it immediately. This was what he had been waiting for, what he had been maneuvering to create. The moment when audacity and genius would triumph over numbers and conventional wisdom. Without hesitation, Alexander wheeled his cavalry around in a movement so sudden and violent that it caught everyone by surprise. The companion cavalry, followed by the elite hyperspists and 4 battalions of the phalanx, charged directly at the gap in the Persian center. It was a move of breathtaking boldness, leading his most elite troops straight into the heart of the enemy army. The charge was like a thunderbolt from Zeus himself. Alexander's horsemen crashed into the Persian center with unstoppable force, their long lances piercing armor and flesh as they carved a bloody path through the ranks. Behind them came the hyperspists, their shields locked and their short swords ready for close combat. The carefully ordered Persian center began to dissolve into chaos as panic spread through the ranks. Darius found himself face to face with his greatest nightmare. The young Macedonian king was charging directly toward him, his bronze light, armor gleaming in the sun, his spear aimed at the Persian royal standard. The distance between them closed with terrifying speed as Alexander's cavalry smashed through the last line of defenders. For a brief moment, the fate of 2 empires hung on the courage of individual warriors locked in single combat. The personal duel between the 2 kings never quite materialized, but it came close enough to send shockwaves through both armies. Alexander hurled his spear at Darius, the weapon passing so close to the Persian king that it struck down his charioteer instead. The sight of their divine ruler under direct attack was more than the Persian troops could bear. The center of their army, which had held firm for hours, suddenly collapsed like a house of cards. Darius made the same fatal mistake he had made at Issus. Faced with the prospect of capture or death, he chose flight. His golden chariot wheeled around and raced toward the rear, abandoning his army in its moment of greatest need. The sight of their king fleeing was the final blow to Persian morale. What had been an orderly retreat became a panicked rout as soldiers threw down their weapons and ran for their lives. But the battle was far from over. Even as the Persian center collapsed, fierce fighting continued on both flanks where Parmenian's forces were hard-pressed by superior numbers. The Thessalian cavalry fought with desperate courage against wave after wave of Persian horsemen, while the Greek allies held their ground against impossible odds. The outcome of the entire battle still hung in the balance, as Alexander's pursuit of Darius left his flanks dangerously exposed. The crisis came when Mazaeus, Darius's most capable general, launched a devastating counterattack against Parmenian's beleaguered left wing. The Persian cavalry struck like a hurricane, their curved swords flashing as they carved through the Thessalian ranks. For a terrifying moment, it seemed as though Alexander's brilliant gamble might cost him everything. His army was split in two, with his best troops pursuing Darius while his flanks crumbled under relentless pressure. Parmenian, the grizzled veteran who had served Alexander's father Philip, found himself fighting for his very survival. The old general had seen countless battles, but nothing had prepared him for the fury of the Persian assault. His messengers raced across the battlefield, desperately trying to reach Alexander with urgent pleas for reinforcement. Thessalian horsemen, renowned throughout Greece for their skill, were being systematically destroyed by superior numbers. The Persian left wing sensed victory within their grasp. Led by Besrap of Bactria, the Sat pressed their attack with renewed fury. These were not the soft courtiers of Persepolis, but hardened warriors from the steppes, men who had learned to fight before they could walk. Their horses were swift as the wind, their archery deadly accurate, and their hunger for Macedonian blood was insatiable. Alexander faced an impossible choice. Behind him lay Darius, and the promise of total victory. The Persian king's flight had already begun to unravel the enemy center, and one final push might end the war entirely. But to his left, Parmenian's desperate situation threatened to turn triumph into disaster. If the left wing collapsed completely, the Persians could wheel around and attack the Macedonian rear, trapping Alexander's forces in a deadly vice. The young king's decision would define not only the battle but his entire legacy. Lesser commanders might have hesitated, paralyzed by the magnitude of the choice. But Alexander's genius lay not just in his tactical brilliance, but in his ability to make split-second decisions under the most extreme pressure. He could hear the clash of steel and the screams of dying men from Parmenian's position, and he knew that loyalty to his troops must come before personal glory. With a curse that would have made his tutor Aristotle wince, Alexander abandoned his pursuit of Darius and wheeled toward the Chrysasoled his cavalry back. The companion cavalry, their horses lathered with sweat and their lances dripping with Persian blood, followed their king without question. They had learned to trust his judgment absolutely, even when it seemed to defy common sense. The ride back across the battlefield was like a journey through hell itself. The ground was carpeted with the dead and dying, their blood turning the dust into crimson mud. Broken chariots lay scattered like the toys of giants, their wheels still spinning slowly in the desert wind. The air was thick with dust and smoke, making it difficult to breathe, while the screams of wounded horses added their own terrible music to the symphony of war. As Alexander approached the left wing, the true scale of the crisis became apparent. The Thessalian cavalry, once the pride of northern Greece, had been reduced to scattered bands fighting desperately for survival. Their formation had been shattered by repeated charges, and they were being methodically hunted down by Persian horsemen who showed no mercy to the wounded or the fallen. Parmenian himself was surrounded by a small knot of his personal guard, their shields locked as they faced death with the stoic courage of veteran soldiers. The old general's sword was notched and bloody, his armor dented by countless blows. He had already accepted that this might be his final battle, but he was determined to sell his life dearly and take as many enemies with him as possible. The sight of their beleaguered comrades sent a surge of fury through Alexander's cavalry. These Persians had dared to threaten their brothers in arms, had spilled Macedonian blood on foreign soil, had shown the audacity to believe they could defeat the sons of Philip. The companion cavalry lowered their lances and charged with a roar that echoed across the plain like thunder from Mount Olympus. The impact was devastating. Alexander's fresh cavalry smashed into the Persian flank like a battering ram, their momentum carrying them deep into the enemy ranks. The surprised Persians found themselves caught between two forces, with Parmenian survivors rallying behind their rescued commander and Alexander's horsemen carving through their formation like a sword through silk. But the Persians were far from beaten. Mazaeus, realizing that the battle's outcome still hung in the balance, gathered his reserves for one final desperate assault. These were his best troops, the cream of the Persian nobility, men who would rather die than face the shame of defeat. They formed up in perfect order, their armor gleaming despite the dust and blood that covered the battlefield. The clash, when it came, was titanic. Persian lance met Macedonian spear in a collision that could be heard for miles. Horses reared and screamed as their riders fought with weapons that had been passed down through generations. The very air seemed to vibrate with the force of the impact as two civilizations met in single combat, each fighting for their vision of the future. Alexander found himself in the thick of the melee, his sword rising and falling with mechanical precision as he cut through the enemy ranks. His presence on the battlefield was like a flame in the darkness, inspiring his own troops while striking terror into Persian hearts. Men who had never seen him before recognized him instantly by his bearing, his courage, and the way death seemed to flow from his blade like water from a spring. The battle raged back and forth across the blood-soaked ground as neither side could gain a decisive advantage. Persian discipline met Macedonian fury in a contest that would determine the fate of empires. Individual acts of heroism were allowed up in the greater tide of war, as men fought and died for causes greater than themselves. Then, just as it seemed the fighting might continue forever, news arrived that changed everything. A breathless messenger reached Mazaeus with word that Darius had not merely fled the battlefield but had abandoned his entire army. The Persian king had not stopped to rally his troops or attempt to restore order. Instead, he had raced toward the safety of Ecbatana, leaving his soldiers to face annihilation without their divine leader. The news spread through the Persian ranks like wildfire, and its effect was immediate and catastrophic. Soldiers who had been fighting with desperate courage suddenly found their will to resist evaporating. What was the point of dying for a king who would not even stay to share their fate? The carefully maintained discipline of centuries began to crumble as unit after unit broke ranks and fled toward the horizon. Mazaeus himself, the last hope of Persian resistance, made the pragmatic decision that would save thousands of lives. Rather than continue a hopeless fight, he signaled the retreat and began an orderly withdrawal of his remaining forces. It was a masterful piece of generalship, conducted under impossible circumstances, but it could not disguise the magnitude of the Persian defeat. The rout that followed was unlike anything the ancient world had ever witnessed. What had been the largest army in history dissolved into a panicked mob as soldiers threw away their weapons and armor in their desperate flight. The roads leading east were clogged with refugees, their faces blank with shock and disbelief. The impossible had happened. The Persian Empire, which had seemed eternal and invincible, had been shattered by a young Macedonian king and his band of warriors. Alexander's pursuit was relentless but disciplined. His cavalry ranged far and wide across the plain, cutting down fleeing enemies, while his infantry secured the abandoned Persian camp. The wealth they discovered there defied imagination. Golden vessels that had graced the tables of Persian nobles lay scattered in the dust. Precious stones from the far reaches of the empire glittered like stars in the afternoon Sunday. Silk from China and spices from India filled wagon after wagon as the victorious Macedonians gathered the spoils of their incredible triumph. But the true prize was not material wealth. With Darius in full flight and his army destroyed, the last organized resistance to Macedonian conquest had been eliminated. The road to Babylon lay open, and beyond it stretched the infinite possibilities of a world without limits. Alexander had not merely won a battle. He had fundamentally altered the course of human civilization, opening the door to an age where Greek culture and ideas would spread from Egypt to India. As the sun began to set over the battlefield of Gaugamela, casting long shadows across the field of triumph and tragedy, Alexander stood among his victorious troops and gazed eastward toward the heart of the Persian Empire. The young king who had crossed the Hellespont with dreams of conquest now found himself master of half the known world, with the other half waiting to be claimed. The Battle of Gaugamela was over, but the legend was just beginning. In the days and weeks that followed, news of the incredible victory would spread across the ancient world like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. In Athens, old men would weep to hear that a Macedonian had succeeded where their grandfathers had failed. In Rome, ambitious young senators would study Alexander's tactics and dream of their own conquests. In distant China, merchants would bring tales of a Western king who commanded the loyalty of the very gods. The dust had settled, the screams had faded, and the plain of Gaugamela lay silent under the dying light of October 1st, 331 BC. In a single day, the impossible had become reality. A young Macedonian king with 47,000 warriors had shattered an empire that stretched from the Indus to the Mediterranean. The earth had indeed shaken, and when it stopped trembling, the ancient world had been transformed forever. Alexander's victory at Gaugamela was more than military triumph. It was the moment when destiny collided with human ambition and emerged victorious. The Persian Empire, which had ruled for 2 centuries, lay in ruins. Darius would never again threaten Greek soil, and the road to the riches of Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis stretched before the conquerors like a golden highway. But perhaps the greatest victory was not measured in treasure or territory. It was the proof that audacity, when combined with genius and unshakable will, could overcome any obstacle. Alexander had shown the world that the impossible was merely the untested, and that legend could be forged from flesh and blood on a dusty battlefield where 2 civilizations met and one emerged supreme. The day the earth shook had given birth to an empire that would reshape the course of human history.